Thanks very much for giving me an opportunity to reflect on maybe 18 plus years of working in the public service, because I know a lot of people remember me from 2006 when I was appointed as a DG, but I wanted to start off by saying my journey started at the university, as you would recall, when I was already doing my PhD at Wits. I was teaching. I was teaching at Fort Hare before then. And then when I completed my degree at Wits, I went to UNISA. And that's where I was recruited to come into the public service in the 80s, mid-80s, I think. Or maybe even earlier, 80s, yeah. To run a project called the Science and Technology Foresight. So this was an attempt by government at the time to say, what is the future going to look like for the country, and what is the role of science, technology, and innovation in that. So it was a 5-year program. When I completed the program, then I was asked to join the department. It was at the time Arts, Culture, Science, and Technology. So I completed then, it was about 5-year stint. And then after that, I went to the University of Pretoria, where I was asked to be a professor of science and innovation. I stayed for 1 year because I thought the pace of things at the university when I went back was too slow for my liking. But I was then asked to lead a small organization called the National Laser Center at the CSIR. Spent 3 years there, and then I moved to be the executive of the CSIR. And that's where I was recruited to become the DG of, at the time, Science and Technology. I think that's what the name of the department was. And the reason why I'm sharing this upfront is that when I was then appointed a DG, the first thing that I think was in my head is, having worked in this sector, is it possible to think about the sector and its contribution to the challenges that the country faces? So that was always at the back of my mind. Even though my training was on pure science, but I always wanted to know, where does this knowledge end up? So we then initially had to convince the team that you worked with that perhaps we need to find a way of articulating, first of all, sell this vision to your team, which is the executives within the department, and then articulate the role of science, technology, and innovation in socio-economic development, and be clear to ourselves, and then ultimately, of course, to the stakeholders, the minister, and the rest of the country. So that was my first preoccupation. The second preoccupation that I had when I started as a DG,
which is a contradiction, right? Because most people think science is it's a very minute, the granular, not the macro. Because
yes,
you want to know how each part connects.
absolutely. So we'll come back to that debate and how one had to navigate through that debate and how we resolve it. I think that's one of the areas of work that you would like us to talk about. And then the second thing that was preoccupying me at the time, and this was, of course, driven by what was happening in the country in terms of leadership, and, of course, the history of the leadership in the science system, which was predominantly white. So at the back of one's mind, you also wanted to demonstrate that you could create and have a department that is run efficiently, professionally, by the South Africa of post-1994. Maybe one never articulated that, but at the heart of what one hoped would achieve is that you would identify and appoint people. Of course, initially, because most of the people who were in the leadership were white people, we then had to say we can do this on merit with black people and women as part of the leadership of the science system, including the department. Can always reflect back, did we achieve that, yes or not? Now, the thing that, of course, I did not know anything about was how do you get into the minds of the political administration, if you know what I mean. Because even though in my previous stint I was a director for Foresight, I would not know how you integrate your thinking with the ministry. So that was a black box for me at the time. So fortunately, though, the person who appointed me as a minister was a professional person. You know him, Minister Mjwara, a no-nonsense person who clearly articulates what needs to be done. Also wants to make sure that the discipline is part of what you do. So that helped me at the beginning. But he was also an excellent listener. And I think it was lucky that this vision of having a science, technology, and innovation sector that addresses the problems of the country, he had the same vision. So it was therefore relatively easy to engage with him on that. The second luck was that he understood the role between an executive authority, the DG, and the rest of the senior management. In the sense that he knew and he expected the DG to lead the department and give him the tools to do that. So there was a clear role clarification between him and myself, gave us the right delegation to execute the work. We never took that, of course, for granted. We did everything we can to make sure that we managed that we use the tools very well. So that luck then helped me, if I go back to my first vision, to develop this strategy of initially then making sure that you've got the science enterprise, science as developing knowledge base, but where it makes sense, look at whether that knowledge speaks to the challenges of the country. And there was a document at the time which I found in the department which was called the National Research and Development Strategy. Never mind what it means. What essentially was doing was that you do research, so you do any field of research to generate knowledge, but you would then look at how you can develop certain areas. One of the areas was advanced manufacturing. One of the areas was identifying certain areas of geographic advantage. At the time, you know that if you try and look at the skies from the north, you don't see the same things as when you look at the skies from the south. So astronomy was identified as an area where the country has a geographic advantage. The other one was not many people know that the country has a unique position. If you look at the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, they meet at the bottom of Cape Agulhas, not at Cape Point. And that provides a very nice living laboratory to understand climate change and its effects, especially on the fish stocks along the east of Africa and on the West Africa. So we said these are areas that we need to perhaps enhance knowledge generation. But there were others that were looking at, can you look at technology for advancing manufacturing? So that strategy was there. So and it was new because I think it was adopted by Cabinet in 2002. So I only joined the department in 2006. So it was 4 years in the making. So we then all agree that the main task is to then make sure that this document is implemented as best as we can. And as I say, to do that, I didn't have to spend a lot of time convincing the scientific community because it was already adopted by Cabinet. But I had to work with my team to make sure that we find resources. And then I'm going to talk about this vision of building and some challenges there of the team. And then, of course, the other issue on the strategy at the time was that you got a sense as you engage with the stakeholders that there were two groups, as you would anticipate. The group that felt it was a waste of time for a country like South Africa to spend its resources on knowledge to address problems of the country. It should focus on resources on developing knowledge for the sake of knowledge. So we had to navigate through this with our scientific community. So it required a little bit of hearing what people say, but saying this is what we're going to do. And we were lucky Treasury made resources available, so we implemented that. Now, coming back to the internal processes, maybe again a little bit of context. I found that when I joined the department, there were 3 colleagues in the department that had applied for the same job. So I thought that the first 3-4 months was not easy for me. And I had to pick this up very, very quickly. And I didn't go to an MBA class to learn how to deal with this. But one of the things I realized was that when you have executive meetings, people would come with laptops as the modern world. But I realized that in these laptops, as you were discussing things in the executive committee meetings, actually people were not listening to you. They were busy with the things that they wanted to do. So I allowed this to happen. And then also there was a tendency of coming late to meetings. And then also the constant challenge of the proposals that were made, which is fine, there's nothing wrong. But I then try to understand the context, because sometimes when you deal with the behavior, if you don't understand the context, then you miss the point. So I then raised this as a concern. The first concern that I raised was the concern of not coming to EXCO meetings on time. And the second concern was the concern of the ability to listen to each other, because I said what I would like to do as a leader of this organization internally is that the decisions are taken, well, in consultation, but ultimately somebody takes the final decision. And we can't do that if we don't listen to each other. So try to do that. And when I realized it was not working, then I banned the use of laptops in the meetings. And then...
there was no WhatsApp at the time?
No, there was no WhatsApp at the time. People were complaining, saying I'm old-fashioned. I pretended as if I didn't hear what they were saying. Didn't take offense to being old-fashioned. The second one that I thought was also not appreciated, but I had to, is this thing of coming to meetings on time. So the trick that one used was to, and you knew the culprits. So what I would do is I would come early in the meeting, and if the culprit is not there, they come 15 minutes late. You then indicate that you then start with that item, and when they come, you tell them that the decision has already been made. So very soon, people started to pick up the message that we are here to work and we are here to do things as professionals. So those things disappeared. Of course, it took longer for buying onto the implementation of that strategy, but I think eventually people realized that this is the way. And then, of course, others left and moved on. And then that's how we dealt with that initially. So we brought in, of course, mix of people from inside and people from outside. That was always, again, at the back of one's mind, that you do need people from outside to inject new thinking. And since I was in this sector, I was able to do that. So the department then slowly started to unify around the common vision of making sure we implemented the strategy.
And this is before the ministry was broken up. It was still one ministry.
The ministry at the time was always science and technology. It was also always out from arts and culture. Yeah, so it was already DST at the time. And then, of course, like anything else in the world, you suddenly realize that this strategy needs to be refreshed. So I then led the development of a new strategy, which was called the 10-year innovation plan. So that was the exciting part, because now we had to go with a clean slate, but fortunately I already had the team behind you to make sure that you develop that. But as I say, in the science community, there was always this tension of convincing people that you need both. You need both the development of knowledge for the sake of knowledge, develop knowledge in the priority areas that I referred to earlier on, and then also to look at knowledge for application. So that's what the 10-year innovation plan was. It was not always easy, as I say, to communicate that you need all of these three legs of science, technology, and innovation. But the good thing, again, and that's why I started with the context, is that because you came from a sector that you knew, and you also came from a sector where people knew you, it was relatively easier to communicate that you need both of these two legs.
And you knew that you were leading a sector, not just the department responsible for.
Whether I knew that or not, yes, I knew that very quickly, because I think one of the things that I learned from my two predecessors was that they always had that orientation. If you recall Roger Jardine as the first DG, I learned in the beginning, because I was part of the sector at that time, that the first attempt after 94 with him and Rob was to try and convince government that science and technology must be in the portfolio of government. So I was part of the initial policy making. The foresight was part of, really just trying to get the community together to focus on and then, of course, when I was moving into the university, the CSIR, I was still following, the discussions and how those were going to shape the work that we needed to do at the CSIR and how we. So I think that's why I'm trying to figure out in my mind, is it because I knew that, or is it because of this vision that I had at the back of my mind, that you need to have a science, technology, and innovation system that speaks to both? But I think whatever the reason is, I knew that I have a role in influencing what the sector does. And you're right, I mean, further down the line, it was then clear in my mind that you have to lead the sector, especially because the way that we are designed in the science and technology system is that the majority of work is not done in-house. You deliver through the universities, you deliver through the science councils, and you deliver through the private sector. So that then became clear in my mind, but I was just clarifying to you that whether at the beginning it was clear in my mind, or whether it was driven by the consciousness of saying you want the science and technology and innovation that has an impact into the society. So we then continued to develop this 10-year innovation plan. Ultimately, of course, everyone agreed that there is space for people who want to do research and generate knowledge for the sake of knowledge. And there's a space for those who want to generate knowledge that could speak to the challenges of the country. So the document was adopted, And we were lucky in the sense that we went to Treasury and they provided us with the resources to implement that. If you recall, budget of the department when I arrived was about 3-4 billion rands. And then by the time I left, it's still very little of what comes directly to the department, about 10-11 billion rands, still small, but a threefold increase over a period of time.
Transfers.
No, including transfers. That's transfers. We, to run the department, we only use 8%. The 92% goes to the entities to actually perform research. Now, I also want to reflect, so the document and how you engage with the stakeholders, which is some of the things you wanted us to talk about, that's how one navigated both the fact that people knew you and that you had people vaguely who thought there is role because you could demonstrate case studies. Now, coming back to the fact that even I think by the time this document 10-year innovation plan was completed, then a new minister came. Again, when the minister came, because the portfolio of science and innovation, I think, is not widely appreciated and known, we found it difficult to engage with the minister at the beginning because, not because of anything we did, but the orientation of the minister was a minister who was angry. We learned afterwards that she had to lead this portfolio, which in her view, his view, looks junior. Unknown.
Doesn't interact with the public.
Yes, so we had to deal with that emotional part of the second minister who came. Fortunately, the individual was a mature person, and as we were briefing the political principal, warmed up to the portfolio. And in fact, one of the success stories of the work that we've done in the department was then led by this minister. So, again, it's one of those things that are very difficult to say, is it because of what you did, or is it because they found this something exciting that they themselves were going to benefit from it? You know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the SKA.
Yeah. But you had to get through it.
Yes, you have to get through the message. You had to convince them. And in fact, at the time, it was quite a large amount of money that had to be put by those countries that were interested in building the square kilometer array, the radio telescope. But the person actually championed both in South Africa to convince cabinet and other ministers that this is the right thing to do, but also championing the global effort for us to win the bid to actually host the square kilometer array. And then also was eventually the owner of this document, the 10-year innovation plan. So in terms of managing upward, is it because of the value of what you sold to the minister? I am not so sure. Is it the skill with which it was presented, or was it also a combination of somebody who eventually settled down and said, even though this might be a junior portfolio, but here is an opportunity for myself to drive an initiative that would make the country proud. The only thing that I realized, of course, maybe before I say that, the minister then left, and then we had another minister who had been in the department for a long time as a deputy minister. So that also worked well because there was continuity in terms of what we were doing. He also was interested in another part of the portfolio. He fell in love with the paleo sciences. You remember all the discoveries that were made of the fossils in Stekfontein and so forth. So he he was in love with that one. And then, of course, the minister too, who had championed the SKA, came back again. So it was then relatively easier at that time because they knew the portfolio. The nice thing about the minister who went back and forth was that she always also wanted to know what does the science do for society. So it then worked on, if you like, the original vision of making sure that science speaks to the challenges of today. So I was able to work with her in driving the 10-year innovation plan.
Because political cover matters in this
It really matters because, as you know, you have to take these things to cabinet. You have to get other cabinet ministers to endorse, and then you have to work with your other colleagues for that to happen. Maybe let me finish the story of the ministers that I worked with. Then he was then recalled, and then a new minister came. That's where, for the first time, I experienced what other DGs had always told me before.
10 years later.
Yeah, that things don't always work the way that you anticipate. And the objectives that the minister brought were agreed. It was the objectives of a sector that was not fully transformed. We agreed on that. A sector that perhaps needed more young people. We agreed on that. The third part of the challenge with that particular minister was what I call the understanding of the roles between those that have to run the department and those that have to make sure that there is an execution of the policies of government informed by the MTSF. And I thought the minister was not able to distinguish between these two things, and that became a little bit of a challenge. When you learned that the minister was calling behind your back staff to come and share things with him that she should have received through an executive. A minister who would request that when the submissions are presented to her from the DG's office, she would like to know the person who originated the submission. And then a minister who claimed that she had an open door policy, which meant people can come about other people in the department. So that was very tricky to navigate. Fortunately, we had an executive that was by that time united in the approach and the professionalism with which things were done. So it was easy to collectively raise some of the concerns to the political principle of role clarification, is what I would call as the headline. That please give us your needs and let us execute them, and then hold us to account. And if it's done in writing, it helps, because you can then say, this is what I expected you to do, it has not been done, and then we can then fall by our swords if we haven't done it. If we have done it, then we can find a mediator between ourselves and yourself. The one thing that in reflection, that I realized, if I compare the cohort of ministers that I thought things worked well with and the younger minister, was that a minister who is settled in the party is more comfortable with himself and herself than the minister who's young, who wants to still make ambitions to make some difference, because then sometimes the way that people want to make a difference means at all costs I have to do this. So as a DG, it's a case of figuring out how do you then try and manage this and to the best of your ability. But I also learned afterwards that I was also helped by those that had known the work of the department. So that worked in my favor, in favor of us as executives, because the quality of work and the efficiency with which the department was run made it easy for others to defend what we were doing. I suppose if we were inefficient and the resources were not used properly through, of course, the audits of the AG, it could have been different. So we were helped by that, number one. Two, we were also helped by this thing in the political circle called reshuffle. I am not so sure if that particular minister had stayed the course, if I was particularly going to stay, because as I say, sometimes you observe things that happen, but you also start to look at the fundamentals of why this behavior is happening. And if you think the fundamentals of the behavior are things that you are unlikely to influence, then you take a decision that says, I'm not going to influence this, my reputation is important. And then I was going to leave, but fortunately then the reshuffle came to the rescue, if I would call it that.
And it could also be that maybe the manner in which we're bringing information into the political head, that it might have been too scientific, too complex, that you have to change the language so you meet the politician where they are at and not come there with a team of scientists and overwhelm the individual, which can happen to anybody, because they go into these positions through political capital, not through any expertise.
Yes and no. I am happy to take the criticism that maybe the language and the packaging of information could have been adequate, but what I had learned with the previous political principals you engage with is they all of them, with the exception of the first one, who was a scientist by training, came and articulated that upfront, that we are not scientifically trained, but we are willing to listen to you and we will ask you questions and interrogate what you mean so that you simplify the language. So I'm happy to take the criticism that it might have been that, but a mature individual would then say, I still don't understand what you're trying to say to me. And in fact, we try to make a difference between technical issues which the institutions would bring vis-a-vis our role as the intermediaries of translating that information for socio-economic impact. But as I say, I'm happy to take the criticism that says maybe you were too technical. And then, as I say, the last experience then in the last 5 or 7 years was the one of mixed observations on my part. The first one is, I think by 13 years working in the department, we had really, in my view, set up an engine that was working very, very smoothly, well-oiled machine. And again, thanks to the political principles that gave us the space, the tools, delegation of authority to appoint competent people. That I don't want to underestimate. I don't remember a single instant where we had two variations in terms of the appointment of DDGs, in terms of the individuals that we wanted to appoint, and of course the chief directors. The delegations were that the minister would chair the panel for DDGs. I'm not sure if this is standard in the public service. And then I would chair the chief director appointments, and then it sort of goes down like that. But I think the culture of saying we don't compromise to the appointment of people who are knowledgeable on the field, but also, of course, put them in a culture of making sure that things are done in a correct way and there's no compromise on that. So that helped, because if you have this space to focus on other things as the Director General, then you know that the back office is running. And I have learned that if you have a back office that is not working, then you can't go out and be an advocate of the work that you do, because you are spending all the time fighting fires. Now, that doesn't come easy, of making sure you've got an engine that works. People have got differences in how the world works. People have opinions of themselves. What I found in the public service is that there is a sense of entitlement for most of us in the public service, that we forget that the people who actually pay our salaries, we need to serve them. So sometimes we've had uncomfortable conversation with certain individuals. And I want to say this because leadership means that.
And confront it. I've interacted
Yes.
with HODs and managers in general who don't want to confront issues.
It's painful, it's hard, but if you don't do it, it comes back and bites you, because you constantly have to do things that you shouldn't be doing. And once, as a leader, you get sucked into lower levels of things that you shouldn't be doing, it will become obvious very, very soon.
Yeah.
Because as the portfolio that you have to manage grows, you can only spend so much time on each of the portfolio. And as soon as you get sucked and spend more time on a particular portfolio, something else would suffer. For an example, I remember one person in the civil service, not in the department, asking me a question. And the question was, I always see you in meetings outside of your department's issue. So this is now working within government. And she says she always sees me very calm and being able to contribute significantly. How do you find time to come to these meetings when you're running and your department is running? I said, no, I've got competent DDGs. We spend a lot of time shaping the strategy. We give them the space to execute within the agreed vision, and then we hold them to account. So I don't have to spend time in the time when they have to execute, because they know that they have to account. So I think that ability to find that right balance and fine-tune it so that you have the space to then do what I've been doing in the last couple of months, convincing government that government itself needs to embrace innovation. And that some of the challenges that government has, having driven that vision, remember, from my first and 2 year stints, first 5 years, second 5 years. Now we had sufficient work in the science and innovation system that could help government to make its decisions. So one has been able, therefore, to begin to say during the time of COVID, and you would know this very well, that science is the only tool that you have at your disposal to help you take the decisions that you need. And I think we came to the party as far as that is concerned, even though we would have liked to have locally developed vaccine, but we are now starting to think about that. I've been spending time recently convincing the police that you can't fight crime with batons and shambok and fit police alone. You also need to use technology and new tools. I don't think I was fully successful at the time I came to retirement, but hopefully the mind is conscientized.
Now, you speak about vaccines, you remind me of the state pharmaceutical company
Right.
decision. What happened there? Was the strategy issue, political buying issue, or money or execution?
It's a very interesting question you're asking. The science of developing vaccines and the capability in South Africa is not a problem. However, if you manufacture vaccines, somebody must buy them. Now, when we entered that space of saying, if you ask us as a science community to develop the antigens and the ingredient, we can do that. Of course, it requires some investment. But are you, as the procuring department, willing to buy these vaccines? That's where the thing got stuck. Even today, that state pharmaceutical company, I know people say, why can't you set it up? It's easy.
Yeah.
But unless you have figured out what we call a state-led innovation with procurement, you're not going to be able to do that. But now that's where we've started. In fact, we've started engaging the procuring department to say, can you have in your policy something that says if you locally produce, you will get certain points than if you bring in from outside. So with the seniority of myself, we've been able to speak to the Department of Health, speak to the Department of Trade and Industry, because you have to then say, what are the things that you are capable of manufacturing locally? And can you specify that through the designations, as you call it? That then goes into the procurement. So there's a small task team that has been put together to say, is it possible to do this within the PFMA? And the answer is yes. Can you then design the point scoring system in the public procurement that says if you locally produce, we give you higher points than if you import? If you do clinical trials there, we give you more points. If you have an antigen that was from South Africa, the ingredient, we give you more points. So we're having a task team. So we think that will get us closer to that. But of course, you also need to know that the South African market is not big enough for you to have a vaccine pharmaceutical manufacturing. But because of what happened during COVID, there is a program in the continent led by the Africa CDC that is looking at Pan-African Vaccine Manufacturing PAVM program. And recently, in fact, we've been getting updates in terms of how the procurers of vaccine in the continent are agreeing that if it's locally produced, Gavi is one of them, and others, through the PEPFAR, the US presidential program. So they've agreed that they would do that, but of course this is a complex space, because even if you produce, Department of Health buys, the market in South Africa is not big enough. You'll have to look at the SADC and the Pan-African market. So then I've spent, as I say, the last 5 years then trying to get into government. You have a science system that can help you with the challenges you have. We are lucky now, we've just had a meeting with the disaster team that is looking at how you use scientific tools as early warning for disaster. But we are exploring how you can use knowledge to make sure that when you plan at local government, you plan for a climate resilient future. So don't put people in areas where you know you're going to have floods during the flooding season. We have enough knowledge to understand, the climate change and the variability in which areas would be affected. I mean, we started off by asking a simple question. Why is it that every time in Kales River, people know it as Ladysmith? That's why the registration is NKR.
Yeah.
Why is it always flooding there when it's raining? So it means there's a localized area that when you have floods, you are likely to have that area flooded. So what does that mean? Should you raise the bridge so that you have enough space for the flow so you don't have the flooding. Are there areas where you should probably redesign the city? So that's just some of the work where the second part of what we started to say, use knowledge to address the problems that we have in the country. So I think even though I have left the agreement that there would be an interministerial committee that will drive the science and technology initiatives across government, where we will then continuously use that platform to say this is what science can do for human settlements, this is what science and technology can do for health, this is what science and technology can do for economic growth, would begin to increase in the years to come.
And those require that as head of department or as a senior manager, you must have the ability to build the case and present the case, like with the SKA, for example.
Absolutely.
A case that should be built, presented, lobby, manage the politics,
And then
the fiscal part of it,
yeah.
and as well as the global interest, and see it through the system.
What in the last days before I left, we started to build in the department something which we call a techno-economic capability. What it means is, what are the social and economic impacts of this knowledge that you are developing? Sometimes you need numbers, and sometimes you need case studies to say this is something that you can do and it does benefit the country. I'm gonna share two of this as part of what you're saying, that you can't just say to people, I know I love science, or science is good. You need something concrete. With the SKA, as you know, we built the 64 dishes. You've never been there.
I've been there.
Have you been there? 64 dishes.
With 2 deputy presidents.
Okay. So the science community and maybe the public knows this as an instrument that is picking up signals from 13.6 billion years and understand what happened in the 400 million years of the start of the universe. And they say, why are you interested in this? But as you know, as soon as the signal gets onto the dish reflects it onto the smaller receiver. The receiver then turns that signal into a digital signal. And once you convert it into a digital signal, it's just like any digitized data that you have to analyze. So even though we're calling it a telescope, it's actually a digital data processing machine. So what we have done now, because we were able to invest in developing our own this digital machine, an analog digital converging machine, we now have the expertise of analyzing data in South Africa, which is needed for the digital economy. Yeah? We now are getting contracts from building the full SKA. Remember, we built our 64 dishes for South Africa. But now the SKA global community is building out 133 dishes over 64. And they're drawing on the expertise of South Africa, and we're winning contracts. So what we did was to ask Urban Econ, it's a company of economists, to look at what are the social economic impact of this infrastructure. And they've done the calculation that says we have a return on investment of 107%. So out of the money that you put in, you've got the money back, and it's 7%. And we are not even at the full construction of the SKA, so it will continue to grow. So when you use, when I went to Duncan, the DG of National Treasury, with his numbers, and say we need additional funding to roll this thing out, he says he doesn't think it's going to be a problem to get additional funding, because you could argue with numbers, and then of course is a scientific infrastructure, and then we've also, the Urban Econ did a detailed study of the social impact in Carnarvon. Now we are finalizing an astrotourism strategy with the Department of Tourism tourism opportunities that will come as a result of people wanting to come and see the origins of the universe in Sunderland and in Carnarvon. So we've been able to produce that. So it's becoming easier to go and convince the funders. And of course, those that say science is not benefiting the country. The second example is there is a machine at Itemba Labs. When you drive out of the airport in Cape Town and you're going to Stellenbosch, there's that place that is making films. I'm sure you've seen it. Yeah, next to that place, there's a place called Itemba Labs.
Yes.
It's a cyclotron. It's a machine that accelerates electrons and bombards a certain material to produce isotopes.
Yeah.
Now, isotopes are exported for diagnostic and therapeutic. We are the third in South Africa largest exporters of these radioisotopes, which are used globally for this medical imaging. If you have a cancer and you don't use chemotherapy, you use these particles called neutrons and protons to kill very sensitive tumors. If you have a tumor in your brain, if you use chemotherapy, it will damage normal and working cells. So you need targeted. So if you want to then get to know which part of your brain has got, if you use some of these radioisotopes, it gives you a picture of which part is actually damaged and which. So it becomes something that gives you a contrast, and then you can then kill those cells. It's done here with Professor Mark Sateka. I don't know if you know him, here at Steve Biko Hospital. They've been able to extend the life of patients that were diagnosed as you're going to die in the next 3 months, extend their life by many, 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 many years. We're still collecting data from him, working with him because we funded this nuclear radiation facility. So these are just examples. So just going back, we are now developing the capability of beginning to develop these case studies so that when you come to convince the political principals to continue to fund research, but also to convince the scientists that the work that you do does have an impact, because we also have to convince them. And also internally for us to have an M&E that is fairly robust in terms of our own selves, to convince ourselves, are we using the public resources properly? So that's what we've done, and hopefully it will be taken up by the next team.
And the PBMR, it's something that we could have lost in how the case was built, or at the time, austerity pressures were such that regardless of the case, PBMR had to go.
Yeah.
It's a combination of things, including
the Jew. We should put them in the same category. And then maybe those two is a classic case of the capability of the science system and its ability to do what the rest of the world can do. If we take the Joule, we had an electric vehicle in South Africa before the ones that you see on the road. And I was told at the time that that car had a battery management system that was better than anyone in the world. And in fact, it had the longest range. I think it would go up to about 400, 500 kilometers with the batteries being charged. And then the second one is a PBMR, where it's a modular reactor to produce electricity from nuclear. Now, in my view, both these, okay, let's fast track so that we can come back to the result. The market for these modular reactors, PBMR type, it's several billions of US dollars, and people are putting them in the marketplace now. The company that is doing that predominantly with the knowledge and the IP is Westinghouse in the United States. So Who are the scientists who are developing this PBMR?
They're from here.
Okay. The next energy vehicles that you see on the road and the battery management system is the technology that was based. So both of them, it seems, when it comes, the ability to innovate is not a problem in South Africa, but the ability for decision making in government to embrace this and take these things into the marketplace, it seems we are finding ourselves wanting. The PBMR in particular was stopped because it was associated, from what I hear, with a particular minister who was championing this. And unfortunately, sometimes you do need a champion.
Yeah.
But when, if you like, the political things unfolded, then instead of looking at this as something for the country, because it was associated with Minister X, who was associated with President Y, it had to be killed. So our ability and our decision making, in my view, needs to be matured a little bit. When we
costs were used as a pretext.
As a pretext, it's the same thing with the jewel. People were saying the amount of money that you need to commercialize this is too much. Nobody said, how much will we make if we put these things into the marketplace? You know? By the way, those cars are still available at Nelson Mandela University if you want to see them. And you can still drive them. Yeah?
Oh, it's driving.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you want to get in there and drive them, is it okay? So I think that
this was a PPP, was Nissan.
Yes. I think we need to learn. But in both instances, if we link to the question you asked about vaccine, there is no country that has developed technology and products, and they expect somebody else to buy, but they don't buy. Now, you know this as well from the Roy Falk. We can say anything about the Roy Falk as technology which was busting sanctions. But we had an aircraft that could fly. We had an aircraft that could fire. An aircraft that somebody else was willing to buy. And I'm told one of the stories was one Middle East country that wanted to buy Roy Falks. And they asked one question in a meeting: has your Air Force bought this Roy Falk? The answer was no. And then they started to talk about the weather because they thought these people are not serious.
Yeah.
You know? So the innovation and the science is one part, but if you want to enter into a game of local manufacturing in South Africa, I suppose we still have a role to play as a DG, just coming back to the context of the conversation. And maybe we have to produce more numbers, but at some point you need to make the tough decisions. The Chinese are putting products into the marketplace. When you go to China, 60% of these cars are driven by Chinese.
Yeah. So which speaks to the issue of our ability as senior public officials to develop the ability to manage and balance the interest, right? Because in everything we do, there are interests internal in the system, the government, the state, external, and also even global, which then expands the span of work, the horizon. And if you're running a large department, you could feel overwhelmed.
Yeah. Two lessons for me. I mean, my experience in relation to what you're saying, I will draw on the cluster system as an institution that is well designed, but it has not fulfilled its responsibilities. Because the work that we do, or the work that the science, technology, and innovation does, will not go anywhere if the Department of Trade and Industry doesn't see the complementarity. If the Department of Mineral and Energy doesn't see how this helps itself, if this does not assist with the Department of Forestry, Fisheries, and Environment in terms of environmental issues. So my experience is that this still remains the biggest problem. I'm going to give you two examples. I always like to give examples to illustrate the point. At the moment, we have developed knowledge since 2008, 2009, where you could produce hydrogen fuel cells in South Africa. Now, hydrogen fuel cells are basically a chemical device that takes hydrogen and produces electricity. For it to do that, it uses platinum, right, to convert hydrogen into a proton and an electron. And I think everybody knows that now in South Africa because the Minister of Electricity says we need protons and electrons.
Yeah.
Electricity, that's what it is, right? Now, this knowledge has been developed in South Africa. Right? The second thing you need for this hydrogen economy is you need to convert water, which is H2O, everybody knows that, so that you can split O from H2, so you have hydrogen. That process is called electrolysis. Again, it uses platinum. So if you think about this, what we've done is we've done, under this techno-economic capability, studies that show that if South Africa, with its own procurement, own manufacturing, value addition of platinum that we mine into these membranes that convert hydrogen into electricity, we could generate about 11.4% of GDP by 2050. It's a sector that is about the size of the agricultural sector, a little bit more than that. Agriculture at about 9%. And the number of jobs and the skills that you would have, and we've done this. But I'm battling to get somebody to see the value of this. In fact, what we do is we continue to import these fuel cells from China, Japan, and the rest of the world. And lately, we requested that there be a coordinating structure because the countries that have been able to generate 11.4, 12, 13% of GDP on new industries are the ones where this thing is managed at the central high office level. I don't want to tell you what happened when I went to present this to Cabinet. Well, but all I can say diplomatically is that we have a long way to mature in taking decisions that are coordinated at the center for them to be implemented with speed and the agency that we need to create the jobs that we need in South Africa. And stick to them. Yeah. And don't change when one minister leaves for the other. You know? So that's an area of work that I don't know what would make us see this as something that can transform the economy through science, technology, and innovations. I don't think it has something to do, even with the numbers that you present. It's got something to do with the psyche. We were just talking about it as we were moving, because that's one example. The second example, and then I'll come back to the psyche of ourselves and not seeing opportunities. The second one is, we've been speaking to ESCOM now, and we are battling to get to them. You can have renewable energies tomorrow deployed everywhere in South Africa. Renewables energy are photovoltaic with batteries. You still have to recycle the batteries, and the wind. The wind and you still have to put them in the grid if you have to power the whole country. But of course, there will be days when you can't have sun and so forth. So we are still going to need coal-fired power stations in South Africa, number one. Number two, if you imagine how many people are employed in the coal mining, how many people are in the coal-fired power stations, if you shut that industry down, have you got another industry that is lined up for absorbing those jobs? Maybe not all of them, because maybe some people will not be retrainable. So what we are proposing, and this technology now is available, is that if you take this unit, which we've developed with Luxembourg company that wants to now repatriate the knowledge to South Africa. And you plug it in the chimney or before the chimney of the stack from a coal-fired power station or a cement factory. And then you inject hydrogen and or ammonia. You can absorb all of the carbon emissions. If the stack contains nitrous oxide, which is one of the pollutants that go into the chimney, or sulfur oxide, sulfur coal produces a lot of, and you inject hydrogen, you can produce sulfuric acid. So you're converting pollutants that go into the atmosphere and you're generating new products. Ammonium bicarbonate will come from a cement stack, cement factory stack. Now we did this thing in Dwaalboom. We've got the data. It shows that you've absorbed 90% of the CO2. So forestry should be saying, we insist that Eskom, Sasol, you use this technology. We're battling to get this thing done. Sulfuric acid is used in Eskom for other applications, so they don't have to buy sulfuric outside. They would use this byproduct. We import 90% of fertilizer in South Africa. This ammonium bicarbonate is an input into the fertilizer. So you can create, but we're just battling, just simple decision making. This is not something which is in the lab. We've got a unit. If you go to Kelvin Power Station, you will see it tomorrow. Speak to, because we've been partnering with him, the advisor to Minister Electricity, Silas, yeah. Just talk to him. He's the one who's helping us to say to Eskom, get on with this. We've said, give us the power stations where we're going to pilot this. The inertia of decision making is, and I was saying, I wish, when we go to China, we don't look at the end product. When we go to Singapore, is what is it that they do? When they say, this is the route we are doing and we are going to take it. Of course, maybe with the e-tolls and what has happened, maybe we need to be careful about being too decisive. But nevertheless, if you've done your homework and something needs to be implemented, get on with it.
Yeah. Well, in China, there are e-tolls everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, but what I'm saying is that when I went to this hotel in Nanjing, in fact, I feel bad that I didn't have the time. There's a book about how to govern China, which is written by current president of China. Yeah. It's it's just 2 volumes. 4 volumes. Is anybody in government? Are you reading this? Are you extracting decision making in the 21st century? And how do you transform a communist state?
When we give it, these colleagues here give it to all ministers who come here for training for free. We have copies.
Yeah, now that I'm retired, I'll probably have enough time to read it. But really, I'm really fascinated to know how do you have this psyche? One of the places we visited for the dinner was something called a guest house in this place. Son, it's more than a 5-star hotel, this guest house. And I was thinking of our own guest house. Yeah. And this is a state-owned guest house.
Yeah. We strike with the sound there.
Yeah, but coming back to the point that you raise is that I think we need to figure out what is it in either our history or our psyche that make us not to take the tough and the painful decisions that would help us to move to the next level of development as a country. I don't have an answer, but I think it's a multiplicity of things. But I think if we bring this back to ourselves and myself as a DG, I would take blame. But I also think that, as I said earlier on, maybe the cluster system needs to evolve. I don't know how. And as you know now, we've raised the concern about a cluster system that is just processing CAD memos to be a cluster system that helps in this integration, taking these 2 examples that I've given you as things that it's endorsed by government, and government says it shall be done. I mean, it's the same thing with procurement, you know. Somebody was telling me that the amount of money sitting in government on the National Industrial Policy, NIPP, I can't remember what it is. So this is the money or obligations that gets put to companies when government procures from them. You know this during the time when we were procuring the rolling stock and the train. There was an obligation by the Chinese company that it will have localization and skills transfer. You know how much money is sitting at the DTIC? Well, not money as all cash, but in terms of the obligations that have not been fulfilled by this company. So again, this thing just needs to be triggered. And somebody said, we sign a contract. If you want this contract to create the skills in South Africa, we can't pay you the second tranche because you have not transferred the skills to the South Africans for this to happen. When I went to Malaysia as part of my sabbatical, when Minister Pando said, you've been working for 10 years, take two months sabbatical. I went to Malaysia. In Malaysia, you have in the Prime Minister's office these public procurement contracts are managed there.
In Singapore as well.
Yeah. So they don't mess up with this policy. I mean, they were telling us that when they were looking for buying arms, when they found that Denel was the best in terms of these cannons, you know, that move around and shoot, they said South African cannons were the ones with the fastest rate of shooting. I'm sorry to use this example. And they wanted that technology in Malaysia. It was managed very tightly with Denel, and they would not be paid unless there was. So it's an execution machinery that then says we've passed the policy, now let's get on. Is it a policy level? Is it us as civil servants that are probably not doing what we're supposed to do? I suspect it's a mix of both, but I think maybe as civil servants we can raise our game a little bit more.
Yeah, let's say where I want to close with DG is part about me, you and others being heads of departments, presiding over money, people, mandates, and all things being equal, political support, but not being able to master the art of getting things done. So if you were talking to a group of new DGs and DDGs and other senior public servants, what would be your advice for creating and mastering the art of execution? So there's diligence in the things that we do. If we have to manufacture vaccines, we are given money, there are people for space, how do you get things done? And at times, even if you don't have money and the resources, what do you do to mobilize those resources to get on with it?
So who am I advising?
Well, these are, say, new, maybe they could be new or relatively new HODs, DDGs, and CEOs of public entities, the people who struggle with this question, you know, getting things done in their institution.
Well, I say my training didn't help me because before you solve the problem, you need to know what is the problem. When I joined as a DG, the role of DGs vis-a-vis the role of political principal was different. So that's the first problem. That role has changed now. So that's why I'm careful not to just answer the question to only the DGs, because in fact, you in one of the conversations said to me the first cohort of DGs were able to transform the public service that was having a particular orientation, dismantle the things that were there to support the previous government, and they started to introduce new programs. Not done by ministers, just done by DGs. But the DGs were given the space to do that. And the role of the DGs vis-a-vis the role of political principals, in my view, was very clear at that time. How it got to be that clear, for me, I don't know, because I wasn't there. But I do know that the first cohort of presidents knew that the role of the political principles is to drive policy and public accountability. But the execution is done by the civil service as a machinery that is held accountable by this. Now, somewhere along the line, this changed. And an impression was created that ministers do things. I was saying to my wife and friends, when I grew up in the township in Durban, I didn't know who the mayor was. I frankly didn't care. Because if there was a sewerage problem, it was fixed the following day. I didn't have to say the mayor must be responsible for this. I only saw the mayor during July Handicap with the chains when they were showing. That's the only time I would see the mayor, But before that, I wasn't listening to radio that the mayor is responsible. So it's the same thing. Somewhere in South Africa, we have created an impression that political people do things. They don't, in my view. They have to make sure that the public resources and the policies of the government are executed. The policies of equity, the policies of making sure that the resources don't end up in Centurion and not in Mamelodi. You don't do that by getting involved in the procurement. You say this is the policy. Municipal manager, make sure that this happens. DG and your team are going to. So the first thing in terms of what you've asked me to solve this problem, we need to find a way of inverting the pyramid back to how do we make sure that the roles are clarified without being disrespectful to ministers and mayors and premiers. But you just don't have the time to do this and no, the expertise to do this. That's why you have a department or group of departments that help you to do that. And then the second part of the response to your question is that can we please try and make sure that we appoint competent people? I don't think we do that. How honest should I be when it comes to this?
Well,
because
I suppose we couldn't ask as DGs because sometimes we...
No, I've now sat on about 3 or 4 panels interviewing DGs. Out of the 4, only 1 was appointed on the recommendation of the panel, of both ministers and DGs who were sitting in the panel. The minister said, I want this person outside of what the recommendations of the panel having gone through. So that's another problem. I don't want to cast any view on ourselves as DGs, but I think we need a rather much more robust way of selecting leaders of departments with the knowledge and the skill set that they need. And maybe, in fact, promoting internally sometimes helps, but I think sometimes promoting, as you asked me earlier, on someone who knows the sector as a whole might also be much better. But I think let's go back and think about how do you invert the pyramid role clarification, how do you make sure that the process of appointing DGs is a bit more robust.
And then DGs, CEOs, also
So,
hiring.
there are, you remember in my conversations that I was lucky that we were given the space to appoint people who, 90%, I mean, we've made mistakes, 1 or 2, but I would say people whose tenure were not confirmed after the probation is probably less than 2%. So which means.
But then, lastly, DG, we are human. HOD, senior public servants, they are human beings. What are your views on how they balance being the technocrat managing the politics and all, but also still being human? I mean, including being human even amongst their own colleagues, and also their friends and beyond. Because this job can suck you, right? You can be lost.
Yeah. One thing that not for me, maybe people can have a view about me, that I've learned in leadership, which I'm not so sure whether it's taught in any business school, is something called self-awareness. I've seen it with some of the leaders of the institutions that we work with. That, what do I mean by self-awareness? Are you aware of yourself within the ecosystem that you're part of? And are you aware of the decisions that you make as an individual and the impact of those decisions to those immediately around you, your staff, and the impact? I think finding that balance right is not an easy thing to do. And I have therefore thought maybe on an ongoing basis we need mirrors that would help us in this self-awareness thing. As I think it's one of those things, and I've always said to my team, I have my own blind spots. Sometimes I know them, sometimes I don't know them. And I'm relying on you to come and say, DG, with due respect, you invited us to come and tell you what your blind spot is. Here is one that I just want to share with you. And you need to open yourself to that criticism. And some of the meetings, and I know I was not very popular with my DDGs on this, is that some of the meetings, I say they are not rank meetings. So it's not about what you say as a director to chief director. It's about the value of what you're saying. So that issue of self-awareness, I think it's something that perhaps we need coaches to help us with that. To say, well, every time you speak to the minister, you're arrogant. Maybe somebody needs to tell me that.
Yeah.
Somebody who says whenever you speak to the stakeholders, you talk down to them. Maybe we need that. Maybe somebody who says you don't show appreciation to your staff when they actually do the work and not you. All of those things are very, very important. You're not respectful to your colleagues because when you're supposed to meet with them, you don't come on time. So I don't know if that answers your question. And these things are important. As I say, in my solution to that is that maybe we do need people to sit in meetings with you, sit and say, Busani, be careful. You don't give your staff a chance to speak. Or when they speak, you're not really listening carefully to what they're saying. You have to, as a leader, create the space for that criticism to come in whatever way that makes you comfortable. But sometimes it's better to just put it out there and say, I've got my own. I call them genetic flaws that we all have.
So otherwise, we have no regrets. It's been a good run, longest serving DG.
Yeah, no regret.
And you would not have chosen to be at Sasol or at some other laboratory. In a good space to be in.
Yeah, I remember I came from being a lecturer at the university. I still find lots of young people you meet that says, hey, I'm doing this now, and I remember you taught me physics and physics 1, and then when I left there, then I came here yesterday, I met a young man at the mall who said, you hosted a global entrepreneurship week in East London. I think it was year 2 or 3. And he says today we're looking at AI that can be used for deaf people at the Innovation Hub, and thanks to you for it. There's nothing as fulfilling as that.
Yeah.
You know, I have just stepped out of the board of the SKA internationally, and they were saying you were the only voice of reason. So when people say that to you, you just get a sense that there's no money that you would have been paid in the private sector that would give you that sense of I've made some contribution that other people appreciate.
Well, it's on those bases then that we are inviting you to join the network of fellows of the National School of Government, so you can share with others some of your insights and perspective. Some of us still have a long way to go. We watching carefully what's happening in the country and government. In particular, we believe that the National School of Government, we can only master our craft if we rely on expertise of people like yourself, UBC, and others who come to sharpen this, because the era of having heads of departments, for example, with some self-illness from knowledge of politics is over. We're likely to have a lot more people who come to just technocratic spaces, and yet the ability to manage the politics, run certain missions, get strategy, as you said, in the organization and through the cabinet system will always be there. You becoming a mentor, a coach, and a voice of reason. We believe that it will help us as we pursue our mandate of building a capable state.
No, thanks very much. No, I'm available. But as I said, the next couple of months I'm entering a space I don't have any clue what it's about.
Yeah.
But I'm sure with the support, I know in the Paris office there's a lady called Wendy. She knows UNESCO in and out, so she should be a great resource. And then of course the DECO team.
Okay.
But I'm sure I'll have the time.
Well, what we'll arrange maybe in July or so, we'll arrange a kind of a closed class, master class session. You'll do your own master class PowerPoint arrangement, and we'll bring a class of people here, and you can have an engagement. We will record it, and then the teams will find ways of using it. We have found that people, when they come here, they feel like it's a safe space, so they do say things like openly. Of course, we really prefer to live cases without offending people, because those things are there. For a case that of life is mainly it's being used frequently, GRA, Mfuleni, and we are building a lot more cases as well. But thank you once again, Dr. Mjwara, for being part of this conversation. There's a few other people that will be interviewing in the coming months as part of building our own unique content.
Thanks and good luck. I think, as you said, the next coming months are going to be turbulent. I'm glad I won't be a teacher here that time, not in a bad way, but